A man in a suit smiles and insists that the young man sign a contract without having to think about anything. The young man hesitates with the pen in his hand, feeling a deep sense of suspicion about what he is doing. He wonders if that deal is truly safe while examining the contract at the coffee shop. The scammer slams the table in annoyance and tells the young man to stop overthinking and just sign it already. The young man suspects the man wants him to scam his school friends, but the trickster denies it. The guy assures him that the money will yield huge returns, pretending he is doing this purely out of friendship. He even brings up how the young man had to take work calls during his own father's funeral. The fraud claims his heart broke seeing the young man humiliate himself like that for his boss. The young man feels furious seeing his father's name being used, but he cannot bring himself to react in the moment. Left with no choice, he ends up signing the paper, genuinely hoping that kindness was real. The scammer smirks wickedly for fooling the young man, and the story jumps forward 2 years in time. In a dark, messy apartment, sounds of someone getting sick start coming from inside the bathroom. The young man appears hunched over the toilet, feeling terribly sick and throwing up everything. He regrets throwing up all the food he had just ordered after such a long time. Now at 28 years old, he lives a miserable, pathetic routine in a completely cluttered room. The scoundrel who put him in this situation vanished a year ago, leaving him buried under a mountain of debt. With 5 hours left before his shift, he decides to read a book to try to forget his miserable life. He picks up the web novel called Dark Header, set on reading for just 30 minutes to unwind a bit. The young man lies on the bed and begins reading the story he has reread over 100 times and knows almost by heart. This story is the only thing that lets him escape his depressing reality for a brief moment. Suddenly, he gasps as he notices something strange happening right in the middle of his reading. Looking toward the window, he sees glowing purple feathers mysteriously floating in the middle of the night. The young man gets confused, wondering if those are black crow feathers floating there. Without any warning, he starts coughing uncontrollably and ends up spitting out a lot of blood. The blood spreads across all the pages of the book he was holding so fondly. He feels an agonizing pain in his chest, realizing something terrible is happening to him. The young man completely loses his breath as a mysterious purple smoke begins emanating from the book. He deeply regrets the tragic, senseless turn his life took. The young man collapses onto the bed covered in blood, wondering if his life really ends in such a pathetic way. As he tries to accept his tragic end, he feels a strange energy rising from the depths of his soul. Even on the brink of death, the last image in his mind is the smirking face of that wretched scammer. Numerous dark feathers encircle his body in the room, while he regrets not being able to do anything. Suddenly, he opens his glowing eyes in a dark place, surrounded by floating feathers. The young man wakes up startled in a luxurious bed, wondering if all of that was just a bad dream. His eye glows an intense shade of blue as he tries to figure out exactly where he is. Looking around, he realizes he is inside an extraordinarily fancy and grand castle bedroom. He feels something on his head and is surprised to see a crow perched there, nuzzling his hair. The young man finds it super odd that a crow is acting so friendly toward him out of nowhere. The bird flaps its wings and starts moving, drawing his attention to the bedroom window. Several crows fly through the night sky outside, illuminated by a mysterious bluish glow. As he looks up at the sky, he is completely shocked and left speechless by what he sees. He sees 3 colorful moons shining in the sky, one red, one blue, and one yellow. The young man spots a flag featuring the 3 moon symbol and realizes where he actually ended up. Looking at his reflection in the window glass, he understands that this world is not his reality. The young man realizes he has now taken over the body of Prince Lan Aviran from the novel he was reading. Someone knocks on the door asking to enter, and he panics as he feels his body failing him. On the other side, a maid hears the strange noises and hesitates to open the bedroom door. The protagonist falls face first onto the floor, agonizing in unbearable, excruciating headache pain. The maid says she will come back later, while he confirms he truly became Prince Lan Aviran. He realizes that somehow he ended up inside the story he read so many times in his life. He realizes he entered the novel Dark Header and took over the body of the 7th Imperial Prince named Lan of Iron. The big problem is that this young prince's fate in the original story is an early and extremely miserable death. He sits in thought, trying to figure out how he ended up inside that book, and inside the body of such a doomed character, no less. At that moment, a man wearing dark glasses enters the royal room, formally introducing himself as Sign. The young man immediately recognizes the man as the 7th Prince's official secretary, feeling a chill run down his spine. The secretary enters the room with a young maid, saying he grew worried after learning the prince skipped dinner. He says he brought a light meal just to be safe and cynically asks if the prince is feeling any better. The young man tries to stay calm so he can start acting exactly how the real prince would act in that situation. The young man replies that he is already feeling better, and the secretary feigns shameless relief at that response. Then the secretary coldly orders the maid named Anna to serve the food to the prince right away. The maid trembles heavily while serving a simple dish, and the young man notices the meal is far too humble for royalty. He tries to be gentle, mentioning he can pour his own tea, but ends up scaring the girl as he reaches for the teapot. The teapot ends up dropping, spilling liquid all over the table and sending the maid into full-blown panic. The girl's expression is pure terror, as if she were about to be sentenced to death for that simple mistake. She throws herself to the floor, desperately begging for forgiveness, leaving the young man thoroughly confused by such an extreme reaction. The poor girl wipes the floor while crying uncontrollably, while he thinks it's a huge exaggeration to act like that over spilled tea. Suddenly, he remembers a crucial detail and realizes that Prince Lan Averin was actually absolute trash. He recalls that the original prince used physical violence and even took the lives of servants, making him the worst early villain in the book. The secretary remarks how surprised he is to see the prince acting so calm and composed. Smirking slightly, he apologizes for interrupting dinner, but says he needs to address an urgent matter with the young man. The man presents budget documents and asks the prince to sign them quickly, claiming they are crucial matters. The young man knows it is all a big lie and wonders what kind of important business a useless prince would even have. He realizes right away that the document is forged, designed only to steal funds belonging to the 7th prince himself. The villain pulls this off easily because he is related to the Empress, who wields massive influence in that world. The young man remembers the old prince signed everything without reading and hesitates on whether to follow the original story or change his fate. The secretary scoffs, asking if he forgot how to sign his own name, showing total mockery toward the young man. The young man gets deeply angry, realizing he is being mocked by a mere staff member despite inhabiting a royal body. The man cynically insists, telling him not to think about anything and just sign the document without questioning. The young man holds the quill, and that phrase triggers a terrible memory from his former life on Earth. He clearly remembers the scammer smiling and saying those exact same words to make him sign that contract. The young man feels immense fury, realizing this unfair situation is identical to his past of humiliation. He makes a firm resolve in his mind that he will never allow himself to be trampled and tricked by anyone ever again. The prince questions the secretary, pointing out he analyzed the numbers and noticed a clear waste of budget right there. The secretary is stunned by the audacity, but soon sneers sarcastically, saying he underestimated his intelligence. The scammer tries to brush it off, telling him to sign quickly before the food gets cold, promising to review it later. The man arrogantly repeats that the prince doesn't need to think about anything and should just sign the paper once and for all. At that moment, a deafening sound of shattering dishware cuts through the silence, startling the maid on the floor. The young man steps forcefully near the shards of glass that were just violently thrown onto the ground. The secretary flinches at the prince's actions, while the prince simply says calmly that his hand slipped by mistake. The young man knows full well the empress doesn't even know the secretary, and his whole influential relative act is fake. He kicks the heavy table with extreme force, sending the entire meal and the fake documents crashing to the floor. The secretary steps back in horror, trembling before the sudden rage of someone he considered a useless prince. The young man decides he won't end up pathetically and tells the secretary he must take the blame for the incident. He is determined to use all his book knowledge and royal lineage to survive in this world. The young man glares at the secretary with a deadly look and firmly asks why he is still standing there doing nothing. Next, he points straight at the scattered mess and coldly remarks that his room's rug is now filthy. He authoritatively commands the man to clean up the entire mess, making it clear he will survive no matter what. In that world, everyone knows the imperial family is viewed as divine, and everything exists solely to serve them. They possess radiant blonde hair and incredible magical powers, ruling the empire gloriously and absolutely. However, the seventh prince is the sole exception, powerless and black-haired, leaving the secretary in complete shock. Sign remembers that the prince was always known for having a terrible temper and ridiculous black hair. The secretary gets furious for paying bribes only to end up working for such a useless prince. While the maid watches, the secretary is forced to kneel down to clean the floor in front of the prince. The man cleans up everything, fuming with rage, and informs the young man he has finished the task he was ordered to do. The moment the secretary excuses himself to leave, the young man intentionally knocks another cup onto the floor. The man is outraged by the provocation, but the prince tells him he needs to practice cleaning his room more. With glowing red eyes, the prince coldly commands him to clean up this new mess much faster. The secretary becomes extremely irritated and tense, unsure how he will explain the young man's behavior to the empress. The young man realizes the man is bluffing and decides to act immediately to prevent him from causing trouble in the future. The young prince then turns to the maid and orders her to cover her ears immediately, leaving the girl confused. He threatens to severely punish her if she hears a single word of the conversation, and the girl obeys out of sheer terror. The poor maid covers her ears with all her strength while trembling in fear in the corner of the room. The young man gets close to the secretary's ear and begins whispering terrible things to put the man in his place. The secretary breaks into a nervous sweat upon realizing the prince knows secrets that could destroy his life. The man turns completely pale with fright, as if looking at a true monster in front of him. Sometime later, the other maids talk among themselves, commenting on how strangely the prince has been acting. Young Anna agrees and confesses she is terrified of ending up harmed by the young man before the year ends. Another maid remarks that at least he barely leaves his palace, which reduces the chances of crossing paths with him. Suddenly, one of the girls reminds Anna that she is responsible for cleaning the prince's room that day. Meanwhile, in the royal library, the young prince observes the sunny day and thinks the weather is wonderful. He thinks he needs to maintain the disguise of a rebellious prince to avoid raising suspicions, even though all servants avoid him. The young man celebrates that the arrogant secretary vanished, and he no longer needs to deal with him. He feels relieved knowing he still has 1 year before the original story begins and 3 years before his death. The young man nostalgically recalls when he found the book he reread over 100 times, discarded in an old library. Since the true protagonist's journey in the novel will still take time, he decides to quietly enjoy his free time. Looking up at the blue sky, he thinks about how nice it would be to have wings to fly freely and admire the beautiful view. Suddenly, he feels a violent shock surge through his entire body and becomes completely paralyzed from the fright. His teacup drops to the floor and shatters into 1,000 pieces. As he tries to figure out what is happening, the young man collapses to the ground, feeling an agonizing fever and a terrifying sensation that his body is burning. He writhes in pain, realizing that burning inside his organs is completely unlike anything he has ever felt before. The maid knocks on the door asking if she may come in to clean, while he tries to scream for help without making a sound. Young Anna enters the room and sighs in relief upon realizing the terrifying prince is not there at that moment. Next, she looks down at the floor and gets startled seeing the young man's cup completely broken in the middle of the room. She laments the waste, thinking that if she sold that expensive teaware, she could feed her family for a month. Suddenly, she hears a strange noise coming from the bedroom window and turns quickly to see what it is. The girl is shocked to come face to face with a wild crow that just flew into the Imperial Palace. Bird calmly alights on the floor, right beside the glass shards under the maid's curious and suspicious gaze. Anna picks up the bird in her arms and warns him that he needs to leave, as this is the room of an extremely dangerous man. The red-eyed crow panics completely upon realizing his mind was transferred into the body of a bird. He cannot believe he stopped being the prince and turned into a crow, unable to comprehend the reason for such a shift. The maid says she would love to care for him, but the prince would harm them both if he found that animal inside. The girl holds him firmly and advises him to fly away, while the young man in crow form mentally begs her not to let go. Without hearing his pleas, the young girl simply tosses the bird out the window from the top of the giant castle tower. The young man plummets in a free fall toward the forest, terrified by the certainty that he will be crushed on the ground. He tries to come up with a plan to survive and desperately wonders if he should try using his new wings. Feeling the panic of death, he focuses all his energy and attempts to flap his wings with everything he has left. He begs to be able to fly while continuing to fall at high speed toward the treetops. Suddenly, he feels a gust of wind and realizes his body stopped falling and began gently gliding through the air. The young man celebrates upon noticing he is actually flying, but soon worries if he will ever turn human again. He glides under the sky lit by the 3 colorful moons, taking in the vastness of the kingdom from a unique perspective. Fortunately, the young man manages to return to his human form and decides to test the transformation a few more times to be sure. He is amazed to discover that he can turn into a crow at any moment simply by imagining the change in his mind. The young man wonders if this might be a curse from the crow that landed on him on the first day, since this power didn't exist in the novel. Even without understanding how he gained this ability, he knows he must hide it from everyone to avoid mortal danger. The young man fears that this transformation will completely alter the course of the original story if he isn't extremely cautious. He deduces that the power must be activated by magical energy, but is interrupted by a call for the night's ritual. The young man adopts a serious stance, realizing that the crucial moment he had been waiting for has finally arrived. He explains that the emperor and the princes gather every month for a ritual that actually serves as a succession test. Upon reaching the hall, he feels the huge difference of seeing everything up close and sits in the worst spot at the huge dining table. The young man notices the glow of his siblings' blonde hair and thinks that the 7th prince looks like a crow next to them. A pink-haired young man begins aggressively mocking him, calling the prince a shameless fool. The young man recognizes the provoker as the 17-year-old 8th prince, who is his half-brother and hates the protagonist. The 8th prince slams the table, annoyed by the young man's silence, and starts yelling, asking if he suddenly went deaf. Suddenly, the 1st princess appears and places her hand on the 8th prince's shoulder, demanding that they behave themselves. The young man observes the table and realizes that all the princes are seated strictly in order of rank and power. He explains that the lighter the imperial family member's hair is, the stronger their elemental magical power is. In contrast, the 7th prince has completely black hair and no magic, which explains his bitter personality. He concludes that the true pinnacle of magical power and the greatest authority in that entire empire belongs to a single person. At that moment, imposing footsteps echo through the hall, announcing the arrival of the most feared and powerful figure in the kingdom. The court bows to receive the emperor, who enters the hall bringing glory in one hand and a death sentence in the other. The emperor sits on the royal throne with an imposing expression and orders the ritual to begin without wasting any more time. He approaches an ancient bluestone tablet left by the first emperor to begin measuring power. The magical tablet serves specifically to measure the exact amount of magical energy of whoever touches it during the test. A giant pillar of blue light ascends toward the ceiling, visually displaying the overwhelming strength of the emperor. The young man is impressed by the brilliance, but wonders if in the original story that light really rose that high. The emperor pulls his hand back and challenges any of the princes who wish to test their powers to step forward. Protagonist watches everything in absolute silence, patiently waiting to see who would be the first to take the risk. The first prince stands up with extreme confidence and informs his father that he accepts the challenge to measure his magical powers. The young man remembers that usually only the first prince participates in this ritual, since his power ranking is never surpassed. The heir places his hand on the magical tablet, eager to display his massive amount of elemental energy to the entire court. He makes sure to perform this demonstration periodically to make it clear to everyone who the true future emperor is. Suddenly, the first prince chokes violently, and an expression of pure panic takes over his dark face. The eighth prince leaps up alarmed as he sees his older brother start coughing up blood uncontrollably. The heir spits out an absurd amount of blood, covering his face, while the others shout desperately for help. Complete chaos breaks out in the Imperial Hall as several people scream in desperation to call a doctor quickly. Amidst all the confusion, the young man is the only one who stays calm, knowing the first prince will meet his end and the plot has begun. He explains that magical power manifests uniquely in each member of the imperial family according to their bloodline. The first prince holds control over the element of water, while the second prince masters the element of fire. In the original story, the first prince's test was supposed to show a moderate level of power reaching halfway across the table. The young man is intrigued because the poisoning and downfall of the first prince were only supposed to happen 6 months later in the novel. He panics upon realizing the timeline has shifted and the novel's protagonist was only supposed to appear after that downfall. Furthermore, he wonders why he gained the power to transform into a crow when the original prince had no magic at all. The young man suspects that the sudden manifestation of a brand new power right after his reincarnation is no mere coincidence. Later, the protagonist sneaks into the second prince's bedroom, where the second prince breaks a gold object, demonstrating his brutal strength. The second prince mocks him, calling him a magicless cripple and asking how trash like him dares to show up in his room. The protagonist smirks mockingly and warns that if he were a real assassin, the prince would already be gone without even noticing his arrival. The second prince is stunned upon realizing the young man managed to breach the castle's most secure room without leaving a trace. The blonde brother grows furious at the humiliation, taking his anger out by smashing everything in sight inside his room. The crown prince cannot accept that his perfect routine was broken in such a humiliating way by a failure. He punches the mirror with all his strength, releasing an absurd burst of blue flames fueled by his uncontrollable hatred. The first prince falls to his knees in his room, suffering from terrible pain and coughing up a lot of blood. He realizes in despair that his body burns whenever he tries to use his magic, fearing he will never be able to use his power again. The heir staggers, refusing to accept that this is happening to the future emperor of the empire. He tries to convince himself that his body is vastly superior to others, desperately clinging to his hookah. The prince smokes, trying to relax, but a mysterious voice from the dark advises him to put down the hookah if he wants to live. The blonde gets a massive fright from the sudden intrusion and shouts, asking who the intruder in the middle of his room is. The hookah is smashed into several pieces by the protagonist, who stands watching his brother with a calm smile. The first prince scoffs at the intruder, saying he is just a magicless cripple who shouldn't be there. The protagonist taunts back, saying that if he were truly an assassin, his brother would have lost his life long ago. The blonde grows tense as he realizes his brother managed to bypass all the heavy security of the castle without leaving a trace. He demands to know how the young man managed to get in, and the protagonist simply replies that he climbed the wall from the outside. The hero refuses to believe such an absurd answer, but the young man tells him that isn't the most important detail right now. The young man questions the hare's health, stating that although the doctors pretend everything is fine, he knows the truth. The blonde merely gives a subtle, sarcastic smirk, pretending not to care about his brother's taunts. Next, he lets out a loud, maniacal laugh to try to hide his nervousness in the face of that situation. The hare says he finally understands the plan, accusing his younger brother of being much smarter than he looks. He accuses the protagonist of secretly poisoning him, just to bargain for his own life in the future when he becomes emperor. The blonde points his finger enraged, shouting that his younger brother made a grave mistake by underestimating his intelligence. The protagonist ignores the outburst and coldly warns that in 1 week, he will start bleeding from his eyes and ears. Upon hearing that terrifying and detailed prediction, the first prince becomes completely paralyzed with horror. The young man sits comfortably on the couch and makes it clear that he planned nothing and used no tricks against him. He warns that the hare's health will rapidly deteriorate until his final breath, confessing that he still doesn't know who the real culprit is. The young man approaches seriously, warning that listening to what he has to say from now on is of utmost importance. He stares straight into his brother's eyes and asserts that this conversation is the last chance he has to stay alive. The protagonist flies as a crow through the storm, happy to notice that his brother is a coward and didn't send anyone to follow him. The first prince despairs alone in his room, while the young man celebrates that he can now use him however he sees fit. The bird flies through the rain, thinking about how incredibly useful this crow body is for exploring the kingdom unseen. The bird gazes at the rainy horizon and decides to take advantage of already being outside the castle to do something else. The crow swoops down at high speed, cutting through the rain toward the dark forest surrounding the imperial lands. The next day, the sun shines brightly in the empire's sky, while the maids begin to worry about the prince. A maid remarks that the young man has been locked in his room for 2 days without eating, and not a single sound is heard inside. Young Anna falls into complete despair, thinking that if anything happens to the prince, she will be sentenced to death for it. She knocks on the door, desperately shouting for the prince, asking if he is all right inside the room. The girl hurriedly opens the door and comes face to face with the prince, who calmly asks the reason for all the noise. In her panic, she trips over her own feet and falls to the ground, dropping the entire tray of food she was carrying. The hot food spills across the floor and ends up dirtying the prince's shoes directly, leaving the maid horrified. The protagonist looks down at the mess on his shoe with a completely blank expression, showing no reaction whatsoever. The young girl cries on her knees, begging for her life and explaining that she was just deeply worried about the young man's health. She tries to justify herself, stammering through heavy sobs, while the young man complains that she caused a huge mess in the room. He points out that she dirtied the floor and his shoes, and she begs him to spare at least her family from punishment. The young man sighs in boredom and tells her to clean up all that messes in 5 minutes before leaving once and for all. He warns her that she is forbidden from entering his room without being called, glad that the scare will prevent future trouble. Time passes, and the kingdom's blue sky shines with a few white clouds, marking the start of a new chapter in the realm. The story advances 1 month after the incident, where the first prince allegedly spilled coffee during the ceremony. A rumor begins to spread secretly through the palace that the heir to the throne has lost all his magical powers. This gossip leads the other siblings to view the situation as a golden opportunity to ascend the throne. The young man remembers that in the novel, the first prince tried to quell the rumors by asking to advance the imperial hunting tournament. Mounted on his horse, he feels relieved to see the story following the book, but fears changes brought on by the protagonist. Since today is the day of the hunting tournament, he hopes to find the novel's protagonist and hand over an important item to him. The eighth prince gives a malicious smile, planning to make his move during the hunt, arrogantly calling the protagonist an insect. The blonde brother mocks his black horse, while the young man worries about his impulsiveness before the tournament starts. The young man simply ignores the taunts and rides ahead, leaving the furious blonde brother behind. He pets his black horse, preferring its loyalty over the ostentatious golden steeds of his siblings. The young prince finally arrives at the event venue, observing everything around him with great attention. Before them stretches the mysterious entrance to the grand imperial forest, where the hunt will take place. Right there stands the imposing Tower of Genesis, where the opening ceremony of the hunting tournament is held annually. The young man knows the hunt will begin as soon as the first prince completes the opening ritual at the tower. He reflects on how this tournament is actually nothing more than a cruel political game disguised as a competition. The emperor firmly commands the first prince to prepare to begin the important ceremony. The first prince is asked by his brother Dito what wish he will ask of the emperor should he win. Dito reminds him that the ultimate winner of the tournament can make a special request directly to the sovereign. The first prince climbs the stone steps to display his magical power and demonstrate his strength to all the nobility. The nobles gossip anxiously among themselves, discussing the rumors surrounding the heir's recent incident. The first prince climbs the steps sweating nervously, forced to trust the advice of his youngest brother. From a distance, the protagonist watches it all with a very confident smile on his face, knowing exactly what is about to happen. The hero mentally swears he will deal with his younger brother in the worst possible way if he finds out he was deceived by him. The young man notices his brother's stiffness and mentally hopes he doesn't get too nervous at that crucial moment. The young man thinks that if his brother followed his instructions to the letter, something very entertaining is about to happen. An immense surge of blue magical energy begins to explode from the first prince's body right before everyone's eyes. The mystical energy spreads violently, creating a massive whirlpool of glowing light across the entire area. Sharp waves of blue magical power begin to spread wildly, terrifying the people present. Beams of pure energy strike the surrounding area with tremendous force, causing the ground to shake violently. The guards shout in desperation, warning everyone to be careful not to get swept away by the storm. Facing the imminent danger, the second prince urgently orders everyone to fall back immediately to protect themselves. Regia pushes himself to the absolute limit against his own mental wall, asserting to himself that he is the first prince. With his mouth bleeding, he repeats his own name and that of his youngest brother. Consumed by a deep hatred, he screams with all his soul that he is the only one destined to inherit the throne and rule as absolute emperor. Suddenly, the immense blue energy takes on the terrifying shape of a monstrous creature made of pure elemental power. The year directs all his concentrated power upward, attempting to conclude the ritual successfully. The sky is completely engulfed by the blue radiance of magical power, which dissipates into the air after the tremendous effort. The crowd of nobles watches everything in total silence, their faces showing pure astonishment at what they just witnessed. The experienced military commander respectfully acknowledges the overwhelming power possessed only by the royal bloodline. The people begin to cheer and celebrate, praising the greatness of the first prince after the impressive display. Regia remembers when his youngest brother handed him an ordinary rock, telling him to unleash his energy inside it. The young man had explained that the mysterious stone was capable of absorbing all his contaminated magical energy. He coldly stated he had no intention of saving him, and the heir was forced to accept it in order to survive. The young man smiles, knowing that using that special item from the original story served to guarantee his safety. Suddenly, Secretary Sign reappears carrying a massive backpack on his back while trembling from exhaustion. The man explains that he brought the heavy luggage exactly according to the prince's orders, leaving the young man satisfied. The prince glares at him with the dark look and asks in a threatening tone if the backpack was brought without any alterations. Secretary mentally complains about the wild black horse he had chosen on purpose to try to harm the young man. A blaring trumpet sound echoes across the entire field, announcing that the grand moment has finally begun. The emperor solemnly raises his arm to give the official starting order for the awaited imperial competition. At the royal signal, nobles and warriors charge toward the grand forest to kick off the hunt. The competitors talk excitedly, dreaming of victory as they speed across the fields. The young man decides to keep a low profile and avoid drawing attention, since winning that tournament is not his priority right now. He reveals that his true objective there is to find the legendary former knight commander named Agony Fetus. Young assistant Talon smiles impressed and asserts that the display of mystical power was truly divine. The former commander cynically comments that the true purpose of the ritual is merely to crush the pride of the nobility. Talon panics and desperately begs the Duke to watch his words before someone ends up overhearing. The former commander reflects darkly on the true reasons that kept him alive up to his advanced age. The young prince rides forward on his horse, remembering that the immense hunting forest is divided into 3 large distinct zones. He analyzes a map indicating that the large animal area is located at the furthest and deepest point of the forest. The young man recalls that in the original story, the protagonist presented the emperor with a legendary golden fox. Since it is an extremely rare creature, he spent a long time flying over the region in his crow form to map it out. Analyzing the clues from the book, he concludes that the fox can only be found near a lake in the southwest direction. The prince decides to hurry to get there before anyone else. Noticing that his faithful horse seems to understand his every word, he feels relieved to be carrying the backpack, knowing he needs to deliver those precious items to the Duke. Suddenly, the black horse's gaze changes completely, indicating that something strange is happening along the path. The animal comes to a sudden halt, nearly throwing the young prince off, completely catching him off guard. The young man tries to figure out the reason for the sudden stop, while the horse plants its hooves firmly on the grass. The young man asks worriedly if the horse is feeling ill, seeing that the animal refuses to take another single step. He questions if there is a dangerous wild creature hiding nearby, but the animal simply shakes its head. A terrible suspicion begins to cross the prince's mind, making him break into a cold sweat as he realizes the reality. He looks back at the massive load on his back and wonders if the problem is just the excessive weight of that backpack. Annoyed, the young man tells the animal to stop being stubborn, reminding it that other horses can pull heavy wagons. He threatens to cut the stubborn animal's food if it continues to refuse to carry the weight through the forest. The horse simply neighs with contempt and throws the young man to the ground before sprinting off without him. The young man watches in complete shock as his only means of transportation vanishes into the forest horizon. He realizes the gravity of his current situation and admits to himself that he is now in serious trouble in the middle of nowhere. Meanwhile, the sun shines brightly through the tree canopy of the vast imperial forest during the competition. Young Talon walks tiredly with his pack, commenting that luck doesn't seem to be on their side today. The experienced Duke laments that the weight of old age has finally caught up with him after spending his entire life as a protector. The assistant asks him not to talk like that, admiringly assuring him that he is already considered a true legend. He recalls the Duke's countless military feats back when he ruled as the legendary commander of the Knights. The Duke asks if the young assistant has ever seen the princes up close, and he replies he has only seen them from far away. The veteran states that he will only understand true royal presence when he faces one of them directly. The Duke recalls the pride of his lineage, which secretly protected the beautiful imperial capital for nearly 1,000 years. In an old memory, Talon's father asks his son to proudly take his place to serve the royal court. The man displays the family's massive merchant caravan, which proudly supplies the realm's entire dynasty. The father continues explaining about the business, while the carriage follows its usual route toward the temple. Suddenly, the carriage comes to an abrupt halt due to a mysterious obstacle caught in one of the wheels. The driver nervously asks the noble to step back inside the vehicle while he resolves the issue. However, the man comes across the lifeless body of a poor child, laid out brutally in the middle of the stones. Fresh blood drips down the luxury carriage wheel, revealing the terrible run over that had occurred. The father coldly says it was just a beggar caught trying to steal imperial offerings sent to the temple. He scoffs at that tragedy, claiming without any empathy that seeing such things on the streets is completely common. Terrified, young Talon asks what is happening outside, wanting to step out to see as well. The father shouts aggressively, strictly forbidding the boy from poking his head out of the vehicle. The boy gets frightened by the violent reaction, while his father tries to hide the terrible scene from his eyes. With a cold look, the man asserts that it is nothing more than an insignificant, unimportant occurrence. Back in the present, the Duke looks thoughtfully at the sky, remembering that the little victim wasn't even 10 years old. He reflects on the cruel darkness hidden behind all that flawless nobility displayed by the Empire. Talon pulls him back to reality, warning that they need to hurry to honor the family's prestige. The Duke apologizes and reveals he knows the exact spot where the legendary golden fox usually appears. The prince runs through the forest completely exhausted, carrying the heavy load and swearing revenge on his runaway horse. He regrets not being able to fly as a crow due to the size of the sack, fearing he might lose the Duke's trail at any moment. The young man remembers that even though this area is meant for smaller prey, it still hides unpredictable dangers. Suddenly, a suspicious noise coming from the bushes startles the prince, making him prepare for the worst. Without a single weapon to defend himself, he panics, not knowing what to do if a giant beast attacks him there. He decides to throw a stone from his bag into the air, unaware that Talon was standing right behind him. The heavy stone hits the assistant's face with extreme force, knocking the poor young man unconscious to the ground. The prince gets startled when he looks back and recognizes the hair color of the person he just hit. The Duke hears the impact sound and runs desperately through the forest, calling out the name of his faithful assistant. Hidden behind a tree, the young man realizes he just knocked out the right-hand man of the legendary former commander. Talon is completely passed out with facial injuries, and the prince panics upon realizing his terrible mistake. He realizes he is in gigantic trouble, as he never planned to meet the Duke in such a tragic way. The man standing before him is the famous war hero and former commander of the most respected Imperial Knights. Duke Agony Fetus is the man who will train the true protagonist in the future to change the realm's fate. The young man trembles with horror seeing the legendary warrior there, knowing that encounter happened far too early in the plot. He regrets the mistake, since his initial plans was to accuse the Duke of trying to steal the golden fox he would hunt. With that accusation, he intended to force the Duke to carry the sack of stones as a humiliating punishment. But now, with the assistant knocked out, the young prince's plan went completely wrong and derailed. The experienced Duke examines the stone lying on the ground and immediately realizes it was thrown on purpose. He suspects the real target of the attack might be himself, sent by some mysterious assassin. Talon begins to regain consciousness, groaning in pain, while the veteran tries to help him stand up. The Duke asks the young man to share everything he can remember about the person who struck him so cowardly. The prince fears being accused of trying to harm the legendary hero, which would completely destroy his terrible reputation in the realm. Talon prepares to speak, revealing he managed to catch an important clue before passing out. The protagonist panics completely, not knowing how to escape a situation that gets worse by the second. With blood still trickling down his face, the assistant tries to piece together his hazy memories of that moment. He apologizes to the Duke, saying everything happened so fast that he couldn't see the direct culprit. The veteran hears a sudden sound of snapping twigs and quickly spins around toward the suspicious noise. His eyes glow with military intensity as he zeroes in on the exact direction of the mysterious sound in the brush. Taking advantage of the distraction, the prince runs with all his might, trying to put as much distance as possible between them. The Duke orders Talon to wait there while he dashes off at high speed to capture the alleged assassin. The frantic chase rages through the trees of the vast forest with fast, heavy footsteps on the ground. The young man nearly collapses from exhaustion, feeling that the massive weight of that backpack will end up costing him his life. He tries to convince himself that an old man of that age could never keep up with a young person's running pace. To his absolute horror, the retired Duke appears right behind him, running with the speed of a wild beast. The war hero shouts, demanding his identity, while the prince realizes he is about to be cornered. He considers abandoning the sack to transform into a crow and escape, but regrets the loss of his black horse. Desperate, the young man refuses to give up and focuses all his willpower into his legs to run even faster. He intensely wishes to run faster than any normal human would be capable of doing. A strange, glowing energy begins to manifest around his legs, making his rapid strides effortless. The Duke is shocked to see the intruder accelerate in a supernatural manner, vanishing from sight in the blink of an eye. The warrior swings at the air in frustration, wondering if his own eyesight is failing due to old age. He stops in an open clearing out of breath, realizing he lost sight of the mysterious intruder in a humiliating fashion. Meanwhile, the young man feels his body curiously light and wonders if he accidentally transformed. Suddenly, he hears the sound of approaching hooves and wonders if that cursed black horse decided to return. He opens his eyes wide as he spots an imposing silhouette rapidly approaching through the brush. The young man stands open, mouthed as he comes face to face with a majestic horse, completely different from his former mount. Calm and elegant steps echo through the forest, announcing the arrival of another important person at that location. Prince Dido smiles ironically as he congratulates his older brother on an extraordinary capture. Before them lies the giant body of a monstrous creature, proving the overwhelming strength of the heir to the throne. Dido assumes victory is already guaranteed and asks what grand wish his brother will ask of the emperor. With dark, vengeful look, the first prince smiles, asserting he already knows exactly what he will request. In another part of the forest, the protagonist sits exhausted under a large tree, trying to catch his breath. He buries his face in his hands, completely despairing as he realizes the terrible loss he just suffered. The young man deeply laments the fact that he lost his entire precious sack during that desperate escape. He rolls on the ground, dying of frustration upon realizing he lost the most crucial items of his entire plan. The young man lies flat on his back on the grass, his eyes brimming with tears as he thinks about how complicated his situation became. He stands up resolved, knowing that staying there wallowing won't fix anything, and decides to retrace his steps. Talon turns around upon noticing the Duke's approach and asks, surprised, if the veteran has already returned from his search in the forest. The Duke asks if his headache improved, and the young assistant replies he still feels a bit dizzy. He sheepishly admits he lost sight of the intruder, conceding that the opponent was insanely fast. The young man notices the backpack filled with stones, and the Duke explains he found that mysterious baggage lying in the bushes. Talon examines the material and remarks that the bag seems far too expensive to just be filled with worthless rocks. The protagonist listens to the conversation hidden behind a tree trunk, waiting for the exact moment to retrieve his items. Suddenly, the prince reappears from among the trees, feigning surprise as he points directly at the backpack of stones. The young man pretends to be startled upon realizing he was spotted by them, adopting an imposing stance worthy of the imperial family. Upon recognizing the presence of the seventh prince, the Duke and the young assistant instantly kneel out of respect. The veteran asks if the bag belongs to royalty, and the prince answers, pretending relief for having found his belongings. With a cold expression, the young man demands to know how his backpack ended up in their hands, falsely accusing them of theft. The Duke grows tense at the absurd accusation and calmly tries to explain that he merely stumbled upon the item by chance. The young man arrogantly dismisses the excuse, forcing the veteran to swear on his own life and his family's honor. The prince coldly questions the cause of the injury on the young assistant's face, who keeps his head bowed down. Talon trembles with anxiety under the intimidating gaze of the royal heir, not daring to say a word to avoid making things worse. The prince moves swiftly toward the assistant with a rapid, aggressive motion that startles everyone present. The duke tries to intervene in shock, but the royal heir's action is so fast that nobody can stop the movement. Suddenly, the prince grabs Talon roughly by the hair, delivering a direct and shocking punishment to the assistant. He coldly states that a mere insolent servant should never interrupt a conversation with members of royalty. The young man asks the duke if he could lend him a sword to deal with that personal matter himself right then and there. Talon's eyes widen, gripped by indescribable panic as he realizes his life hangs by a thread in the prince's hands. The duke bows his head begging for mercy, and the prince falsely praises the admirable loyalty displayed by him. He reflects with disdain on how the duke acts merely as a loyal hound for the royal family without caring about his servant. The veteran swallows his military pride and remains silent, enduring that terrible humiliation in total quiet. The young heir mentally swears he'll do whatever it takes to prevent more people from suffering so cowardly in the empire. With a sarcastic smirk, the prince hands over the heavy load of stones for the experienced warrior to carry from there. He warns with a dark look that the backpack is of utmost importance and must not be set aside for anything. The veteran is forced to accept the heavy task, taking on the responsibility of carrying the sack under the prince's watch. He answers in a firm voice, confirming he will faithfully execute the royal commands imposed by the young noble. The prince cheerfully says goodbye and walks off, celebrating the fact that he freed himself from that huge weight on his back. The young man mentally acknowledges his acting was terrible, but knows he needed to plant that seed of suspicion. Devastated, Talon apologizes, but the duke consoles him, telling the young man to return home to rest and heal his injuries. Suddenly, the assistant's eyes widen as he reveals he finally managed to remember who was responsible for the attack. He claims with absolute certainty that the person who threw that stone was the seventh prince himself. The duke abruptly cuts him off, commanding the young man not to utter another single word about the matter. The young man recalls that in the original story, the duke would only start the grand imperial rebellion after the tragic loss of his son. To make the duke act within this year, the prince knows he will need to create a very powerful emotional trigger. Meanwhile, the other princes converse and decide to request permission to develop the lands around the temple. The heir reveals with a malicious smile that his true plan is to eliminate all the beggars in that impoverished region. The protagonist thinks this cruel act will be the perfect push to cause the duke to revolt against the kingdom once and for all. The experienced warrior holds the heavy backpack of stones with a stern face, contemplating the turn of events. A silent prophecy hangs over him, decreeing that his true destiny is to raise a banner against the royal family. The sun begins to set on the horizon, painting the empire's skies with beautiful reddish hues of late afternoon in the forest. The afternoon calm spreads through the dense vegetation as the tournament approaches its conclusion. The prince observes everything hidden in the bushes, hoping nobody saw his transformation into a crow in the sky. He walks toward the royal camp, lightheartedly accepting his inevitable role as the story's big villain. Now, with the hunting tournament coming to an end, the young man knows that the true battle for the throne is only just beginning. First Princess Mental unexpectedly appears in the young man's path, finding it strange that he is walking alone over there. The prince grows tense upon running into her, knowing she is the absolute worst person he could encounter right now. He offers a formal greeting, but the princess tells him to relax, reminding him that they share the same blood. She asks where his horse is, and the young man makes up a story that he decided to walk a bit to get some fresh air. The young princess immediately grows suspicious, coldly stating that she cannot make sense of his excuse. She asks with a piercing gaze why he would lie to someone of his own bloodline. The young prince attempts to keep his composure, pretending not to understand his sister's distrustful insinuation. She reveals she found the riderless black horse wandering in the forest and discovered the animal belonged to her brother. She casually mentions she ordered the animal dealt with, since animals disobedient to the royal family deserve harsh punishment. Feigning remorse, the young man kneels before her, confessing he felt ashamed for losing the horse. The princess asks him to raise his head, saying she doesn't want it to look like she is punishing her own brother. She says she is relieved he is all right and offers him a horse as a gift before elegantly continuing on her way. The protagonist thinks she is a dangerous person for so skillfully hiding her true intentions behind a smile. He wonders why she acted so calmly and questions if her ability failed to work on his body. Night falls, covering the royal camps in darkness while the nobles rest from their hunts in the forest. A medical officer listens to the explanation of Talon's accident and finds the story about the fall very suspicious. The doctor remarks that in his entire career, he has never seen such a severe injury caused merely by a fall on the grass. The specialist warns the Duke that the injury is serious and that the young assistant will need a week of rest. Talon despairs over having to rest, but the Duke places a hand on his shoulder, acknowledging his loyalty. The Duke orders that the young man's health is the top priority and assures him that he and Jack will handle the rest of the event. Moved by his lord's concern, the assistant promises to focus all his energy on recovering quickly. Talon jokes that his dream is simply to have a vacation to rest, since he only works out of a need for money. The Duke chuckles, promising to win the tournament just to give him a gold mine as a vacation gift. Soon, the young assistant drifts into a deep sleep, snoring loudly as he recovers his strength from the terrible blow. The experienced warrior holds a document sealed with the royal crest while watching his faithful ally sleep. The Duke's mind is haunted by the prince's venomous words, calling him a mere submissive hound of the empire. He sits alone in the dark, tormented by the claim that his son would meet the exact same humiliating fate. Unable to fall asleep, he decides to step out of his tent in the middle of the night to clear his head. However, his eyes are immediately drawn to the bag of stones the prince forced him to haul through the woods. The distinct clinking sound of the rocks colliding inside the bag echoes, breaking the silence of the dark night. Under the light of the 3 colorful moons, the veteran walks, carrying the heavy pack, remembering his father's old words. He recalls when his father shared the legend of the great savior who descended from the heavens to bring peace to the world. Back then, the boy eagerly replied, confirming he had already read the entire story about Emperor Sierra. The father explained that the emperor acted as the embodiment of a god and harshly punished anyone who started war. The legend said Sierra unified the lands, founding the imperial dynasty that their family faithfully serves. The noble looked affectionately at the boy, proudly calling him his greatest treasure and legitimate heir. He fervently asked his son to inherit his resolve and become the glorious protective sword of the empire. In the present, the veteran feels the heavy burden on his back and questions why he is carrying those useless stones. He reflects on whether he does it out of genuine loyalty to the royal court or out of blind obedience to an unfair system. Suddenly, a deafening blast of a trumpet echoes across the horizon, catching the experienced Duke completely off guard. The entire nobility gathers in shock upon seeing the astonishing amount of energy gathered in just one night. Rumors reveal that the first prince defeated all the beasts single-handedly, signaling an early end to the tournament. Before a monumental pile of slain monsters, the heir displays all his overwhelming mystical power. The court solemnly announces to the entire realm that Razia is the legitimate winner of that year's grand hunting tournament. The sovereign publicly congratulates the first prince on his heroic achievement, and the young man respectfully thanks him. Following royal protocol, the emperor commands his son to officially declare what his grand wish will be. The crowd of nobles whispers excitedly, wondering what valuable request the heir will make to the king this time. Kneeling, the prince lies, claiming that beggars and vagrants are threatening the security of the temple lands. With a cruel smile on his face, he prepares to seal the tragic fate of all the needy people in the capital. The imperial army mobilizes immediately, invading the poor district and spreading chaos and destruction wherever they go. The Duke is in absolute shock upon hearing the first prince request permission to eliminate the needy. That cruel decision brings back painful memories of the past and the tragic injustice he witnessed on the streets. He remembers the stern face of his late father and the promise to always act with honor and loyalty. Gripping the hilt of his sword, he wonders if he should continue acting as a mere submissive hound of the Empire. To everyone's surprise, the veteran draws his gleaming sword and steps forward, defying the Imperial court. He mentally apologizes to his son, knowing that rebellious act will seal his family's fate. Meanwhile, in the resting room, young Talon mumbles incoherently in the middle of his heavy sleep. He wakes up startled to find the prince upside down, watching him closely in the dark room. The young man falls off the bed startled, trying to greet the royal, but the prince tells him to move slowly to avoid dizziness. The assistant gets confused when the prince advises using olive leaves to treat the wound on his head. The prince ignores the question and alerts the assistant about the extremely dangerous situation the Duke is in right now. Hearing about the closing ceremony, the young man's eyes widen, gripped by sudden panic. Without wasting another second, the assistant dashes desperately toward the location where all the nobility gathered. He pushes past guards and nobles, begging them to make way through the massive, crowded mob. But the young man stops abruptly with a look of sheer horror as he witnesses the terrible scene right before his eyes. He watches helplessly as a harsh punishment is inflicted upon his beloved master in the center of the arena surrounded by soldiers. The Duke is kneeling, defeated on the ground before the victorious gaze of the cruel crown prince. Razia feigns outrage over the veteran's betrayal, shouting angrily for the entire crowd to hear his cruel verdict. The warrior bows his head, knowing he broke the ancient tradition of blind loyalty his family followed for 1,000 years. With his eyes fixed on the heir, the Duke accepts the weight of his choice to try to protect the needy people. The sovereign observes the entire scene in absolute silence, waiting to see the outcome of that grave rebellion. Razia coldly declares he will use that betrayal as the perfect reason to impose an exemplary punishment on the veteran. He mocks the warrior's supposed honor, stating that using loyalty to challenge the royal family is ridiculous. The crown prince begins gathering his immense blue magic in his hands, preparing to deliver the final blow. With a maniacal smile, he warns the veteran that defying imperial authority guarantees immediate execution on the spot. The experienced warrior closes his eyes with dignity, accepting to pay with his own life for that rebellious act. Talon screams in despair as he realizes his beloved protector is about to be eliminated right before the entire nobility. From afar, the protagonist watches the scene, hoping his plan to force the Duke's rebellion succeeds in the end. In another part of the forest, a mysterious cloaked young man fills his canteen with water by a quiet blue stream. Suddenly, the young man senses a strange vibration in the water, indicating a great power is being unleashed nearby. Looking up at the sky, he is startled by a massive column of blue energy surging on the forest's distant horizon. That giant blue pillar of light marks the start of the Duke's tragic execution under the watchful eye of the mysterious young man. That young man watching the horizon is Littell, the true, legendary main protagonist of the novel's story. He explains that the Duke was a hero who dedicated 30 years of his life to protecting the realm's imperial dynasty. But now, the legendary warrior is treated as a mere common criminal about to be executed for insulting royalty. Razia heroically declares he will carry out the death sentence in the name of the Empire's entire glorious imperial bloodline. With a swift movement, he releases a devastating amount of blue magical energy straight at the veteran. The crowd watches in horror at that brutal display of absolute power echoing across the hunting arena. The veteran begins to suffocate inside the giant sphere of magical water, feeling his life force slipping away. About to pass out, he opens his eyes underwater and spots a familiar silhouette that leaves him in absolute shock. He realizes his faithful assistant Talon ran toward him, desperately trying to reach him in the middle of the arena. The Duke smiles underwater, noticing the young man recovered well from his dizziness and looks healthy. He regrets having to depart in such a pathetic manner, but his gaze is drawn to the calm figure of the seventh prince. The warrior notices the youngest royal staring intently at him, mouthing words to whisper a secret message. Amidst suffocating, the experienced dupe tries his hardest to carefully read the prince's lips. He focuses on the silent words being transmitted directly to him through that whisper. Upon understanding the message, the veteran realizes it is not yet his time to give up and that he cannot die today. Oblivious to it all, the crown prince raises his right arm, gathering even more power to strike the final blow. A colossal pillar of blue energy reaches toward the heavens, illuminating the entire area with a blinding, mystical glow. The giant water sphere crashes down with devastating force, marking the relentless conclusion of that royal punishment in the forest. The water attack strikes the ground with absurd force, scattering magical energy across the entire arena. Razia lowers his arm, finishing his ruthless strike without showing a shred of remorse. Talon is held back by the guards as he falls into complete despair, seeing the horrifying scene. The young prince watches everything in silence, keeping a completely calm expression. Meanwhile, Littell remembers when he was a child, studying diligently in his bedroom. Back then, he looked out the window and saw a strange blue light cutting through the night sky. In the present, the hooded young man watches that same blue energy fly rapidly through the air. He crouches on the grass, preparing to follow the trail of that mysterious force. A massive impact occurs in the forest, kicking up dust and destroying the local vegetation. Laddle uses his vision to stare at the glowing sphere that emerged amidst the trees. He dashes at high speed toward that magical energy to see what it is. As he gets closer, he realizes the light is far too blurry on the inside to identify anything. Looking closer, the young man is surprised to spot a human silhouette trapped inside. Suddenly, that energy sphere takes off and shoots through the sky at high speed. The blue glow hits the distant ground, creating another large explosion in the forest. Littell reaches out his hand and runs with all his speed, trying to catch up to the light. The magical water scatters through the air as the mysterious energy begins to fade away. The young man lands firmly on the damp forest floor after the long pursuit. He stops at the edge of the cliff and looks down, searching for any sign. Laddle grows frustrated, wondering if he lost the trail of that glow after all. He observes the vastness of the forest on the horizon, realizing the light has vanished for good. The young man takes a deep breath, wiping sweat from his face, disappointed by the failure. Meanwhile, in the arena, Talon cries, devastated, unable to accept the Duke's tragic end. The surrounding people begin whispering in concern about the future of the Fetus family. A noble announces that the tournament is over and the closing ceremony will take place at noon. He instructs all participants to wait at the location until the event resumes. Rajia arrogantly wipes his hands, proud to have defeated yet another traitor. He walks among the servants, saying that showing mercy to the weak creates insolent fools. The crowd comments that the Duke's family is ruined after such a foolish act. The nobles walk away, leaving the young assistant alone and desolate. Nobody steps forward to help Talon as everyone walks past, ignoring his pain. One man even spits near him, cruelly calling the boy a traitor. Someone watches from afar, knowing the assistant's heart is completely shattered. Despite the unbearable pain, Talon refuses to give up and walks back to his tent. Upon entering, he kneels beside the broken belongings of his late master. On the ground, he finds a rolled-up scroll and grows curious upon noticing the seal. The boy holds the letter in surprise, recognizing the official crest of the Fetus family. The Duke's message asks him to pray for his soul, in case he is no longer among the living. In the letter, the veteran asks the assistant to take care of his son Flen as his final wish. The Duke confesses in the letter that he felt he would make a huge mistake soon. He makes a point to clarify that nothing that happened was the assistant's fault. The boy cries while reading the formal declaration in which the Duke makes his final appointment. The paper slips from Talon's hands as he weeps, hugging the ground of the tent. The document officially names Talon as the new temporary leader of the Fetus family. In a castle tower, sounds of coughing echo while someone criticizes the reckless use of energy. Razia coughs up blood on the floor in a rage, while the seventh prince mocks his health. The crown prince holds a blue magical stone and demands to know why he hasn't been cured. The protagonist calmly answers that unleashing so much magic all at once only worsens the illness. The young man senses his brother's glare of hatred and guesses he wants to destroy him in the future. The young man remembers with a smirk that Regia remains alive solely thanks to that magical stone. Rumors about Talon's condition begin to spread, while the young assistant remains in a deep coma. Suddenly, the young man opens his eyes in the bedroom, awakening from his long period of unconsciousness. Talon stares at the bedroom ceiling, unable to comprehend exactly where he is at that moment. The assistant tries to get out of bed, but the servant asks him to be careful since he is still weak. The worker worriedly warns that he spent 2 weeks passed out and urgently needs rest. Talon adjusts his glasses and demands to know the family's current situation and how the young duke is doing. The servant sadly reveals that business partners abandoned the mansion and almost all employees fled. He explains that the financial situation is dire and that the mansion fell into ruin following the duke's incident. Young Flynn appears in the hallway and spots Talon walking with difficulty beside the servant. Talon is surprised and relieved to come face to face with the late duke's son. The assistant immediately kneels, apologizing to the boy for causing so much worry. Little Flynn sadly remarks that not even his father's funeral was held due to the chaos in the realm. Suddenly, Talon hears 2 voices whispering malicious gossip outside the window. Servants on the street mock the dead duke, saying the boy is nothing more than a worthless child. The assistant listens to it all in silence, knowing the mark of traitors will ruin the family name forever. Talon turns to his servant and calls him with an extremely cold, dark expression. He coldly commands that those men's tongues be cut out as punishment for insulting the young duke. The servant is shocked, but Talon glares at him, demanding his order be carried out without question. Terrified by the new leader's shift in attitude, the servant bows and accepts to perform the cruel task. Talon surprises everyone by announcing that there will be no official funeral for the late duke. He firmly asserts that the former commander can no longer be considered an honorable member of that family. The boy desperately questions that decision, and Talon reminds him that he is now the active leader of the mansion. The assistant declares he will do whatever it takes to protect the honor of House Fetus until the boy grows up. He removes his glasses with chilling resolve, ready to discard his gentle demeanor. Talon states he will use any cruel and necessary method to guarantee the family's survival. The scene shifts to the wrecked castle room, where the fireplace fire remains lit. Regia flies into a rage and throws chairs against the wall, destroying the room's luxurious furniture. The crown prince smashes everything around him while shouting out of pure hatred and frustration. Out of breath, the man rests his hands on the window frame, trying to contain his uncontrollable fury after the defeat. Outside, the maid hears the terrifying noises and gets frightened by the prince's violence. Regia punches the table, swearing to end his younger brother's life with his own hands as soon as he can. He recalls the recent conversation where his younger brother demanded he announce his trip to the Imperial Forest. On that occasion, Regia shouted in outrage, and the young prince explained he needed to handle private matters. The younger brother argued that if Regia announced the entrance, no one else would be permitted to go there. The heir grew suspicious immediately and demanded to know what his younger brother intended to do alone in there. The young man taunted back, saying he was just going to treat himself, telling his brother to sit quietly and wait. Irritated by the audacity, the heir pinned his younger brother against the wall and cursed at him in fury. Regia used his water magic to choke the young man, saying the Empire's scholars could easily cure him. He squeezed his younger brother's neck, warning that his patience was gone, and he would take his life right then and there. Even while being choked, the protagonist gave a bloody smirk and told his brother to hurry up and decide. The young man warned that using magic just shortened the heir's remaining lifespan even further. Regia panicked as he saw a massive amount of blood pour straight out of his mouth. The heir backed away, coughing heavily, while the younger brother warned that without treatment, he wouldn't walk in 1 week. The young man wiped the blood from his mouth and mockingly asked how the royal family would react upon learning of his collapse. He taunted the heir, asking if the king would try to save him or simply discard him for another. The younger brother reminded him that if he fails, another prince will inherit the throne, while Reggio rises on the ground. With a maber glare, the young man told the hare to use his head if he didn't want to end up pathetically. He coldly warned that because they share the same blood, his patience also had its limits. The younger brother walked out, telling his sibling to give up sending spies since he knew how to vanish easily. As he closed the doors, he warned that insisting on it would only delay the treatment and drain both their patience. Reggio takes a deep breath and demands to know his younger brother's true objective. The protagonist merely answers with indifference, saying that not even he knows the reason. In his crow form, the young man flies over the forest, thinking that his sole focus is survival. The bird flaps its wings hard, ascending into the Empire's sunny sky. Black feathers float in the air as the young man undoes the transformation among the trees. Upon landing on the grass, the young man confirms there is no one nearby watching his arrival. The young man explains he cleared the forest on purpose to test his new powers. He remembers when he became a horse and thinks that if he can turn into other animals, it will be very useful. The young man decides to investigate carefully to understand exactly how to trigger new forms. He rummages through his bag, looking for something to help uncover the transformation conditions. The young man deduces he needs direct physical contact with the animal before taking its shape. To test his theory, he begins setting up a small wooden trap on the grass. The young man fixes the compartment with precious fruits from the royal kitchen to use as bait. As he steps back, a curious squirrel emerges from the brush, drawn by the scent. The protagonist hears the noise in the brush, spins around quickly to see what appeared. He is surprised to spot a tiny squirrel climbing up the tree trunk right above him. The young man stares at the cute creature, wondering if he can catch it before finishing the trap. The squirrel slowly descends the trunk, observing the young man with great curiosity. To the young man's surprise, the little squirrel approaches and takes seeds directly from his hand. The young man finds the little animal's courage amusing and jokes about it trusting strangers so easily. Since physical contact happened quickly, the young man decides to try transforming right away. He focuses on the grass, concentrating on triggering the mystical body transformation power. A yellow aura glows around his body as he tries to force himself to turn into a squirrel. The light fades and nothing happens, leaving the young man standing in the same human form as before. The young man reflects intriguingly, thinking he might need a desperate desire to change. He wonders if he needs to feel a genuine urge to climb trees for it to work. Suddenly, the squirrel bites the strap of his bag and dashes off with his baggage. The young man panics, shouting for the little animal to stop and return his belongings. He chases the squirrel across the grass, offering more food in exchange for his bag back. The young man reaches out across the brush and manages to grab the strap of the bag just in time. The squirrel refuses to let go of the bag and keeps climbing the tree stubbornly. Annoyed, the young man pulls the strap hard, determined to win that childish tug of war. The leather strap of the bag can't handle the strain and snaps cleanly in the young man's hand. The young man stands completely frozen in shock upon seeing the damage he just caused. A loud crash echoes through the forest, causing several birds to fly off startled. Night falls over the Imperial Castle, bringing a beautiful view under the light of the 3 moons. The maid knocks on the royal bedroom door, nervously announcing she brought the prince's dinner. She enters the room, praying silently that nothing out of the ordinary happens this time. The girl gets frightened seeing the prince covered in dirt, and he lies, saying he fell during a walk. As she sets up the plates, the young man recalls with relief that he was almost caught turning into a crow. He laments spending the entire day chasing a squirrel without discovering anything new. The maid looks at the prince's torn clothes, worried about her master's condition. The young man tells her to bring clean clothes and mentions he will take a very long bath. The girl hesitates while looking at the bag, and the young man asks curiously about the reason for her doubt. The maid points in terror at the squirrel that just poked its head out of the sack. The young man turns around and stands in complete shock, seeing the tiny animal inside his bedroom. The squirrel leaps from the bag onto the floor, and the young man tries to grab the little creature while shouting. The maid panics, thinking he is going to harm the little creature, and begs him to spare it. The young man calmly turns around holding the squirrel and demands his clothes, leaving the girl confused. Annoyed by the delay, he shouts, ordering the maid to fetch his clean clothes immediately. The maid rushes down the hallway holding the pile of clean clothes for the prince. She despairs, thinking of the poor little squirrel that could be harmed at any moment. The girl tries to hurry, but stops abruptly upon seeing someone standing in her path. Before her stands the imposing figure of the first princess, dressed in her elegant gown. Princess Mental glares coldly at the maid and asks the reason for all the rushing. The maid drops to the floor begging for her life, while the noble grows suspicious of the bundle. The girl cries in terror, swearing on Sierra's name that she isn't stealing from the palace. She explains that the youngest prince's clothes got dirty. While the princess reaches out her hand, the princess warns that it's impossible to fool her and begins using her mind, reading magic. She places her glowing hand on the maid's head to verify the truth of her words. Searching through the girl's mind, the princess is surprised to see the image of her brother. The memory reveals the youngest brother covered in dirt right after returning from the event. The noble smiles upon discovering her younger brother lied and was actually in the Imperial Forest. In the prince's bedroom, the knight remains quiet while he talks to the little creature. The young man tells the squirrel that the palace is no place for him and that he won't keep him there. He opens his arms and asks the little animal to surrender so he can take him back to the forest. The squirrel grows hostile and starts squeaking angrily, refusing to be caught. The young man thinks it makes no sense to have a rodent running free through the castle bedrooms. The situation reminds him of his miserable former life when he couldn't sleep because of mice. Annoyed by the deviations from the original story, the young man lunges to capture the creature. The young man celebrates catching the animal, but is caught completely off guard. The squirrel bites the prince's hand hard, making the young man scream in pain. The young man complains indignantly, while the little creature darts quickly across the room. The squirrel begins climbing the wooden wall of the bedroom with extreme agility. The young man watches the animal up high, realizing he climbed far out of reach. Thinks that if he tries climbing up after it, the creature will simply flee to another side. The young man closes his eyes and thinks it would be so much easier if he could turn into a squirrel. Suddenly, he opens his eyes startled as he feels a strange reaction in his body. A yellow aura begins wrapping around his body, activating the mystical transformation power. The young man stands jaw-dropped, realizing he is actually turning into a squirrel on the wall. He celebrates Hanley finally discovered the exact condition to transform his body. In his animal form, the young man gives a smug smile for having cracked the secret. However, he loses his balance and begins plummeting from the top of the wall in a free fall. The young man panics, realizing that a fall from that height could be fatal. At that moment, Princess Mental barges into the room, complaining about the audacity of the servants. The noble shows her deep disgust, stating that the servants in this palace are awful. Looking at the bedroom floor, the princess stops walking, surprised by what she sees. She comes face to face with two squirrels tangled up on the prince's bedroom floor. The noble covers her face disgusted upon seeing wild animals loose in royal quarters. The maid watches the scene, adoring the sight of the two little creatures together. Trapped in squirrel form, the young man laments the humiliating situation he got himself into. The next day, the sun shines in the sky, announcing a new morning at the palace. Back in his human form, the young man pets the tiny squirrel's head. He notices the little creature didn't leave his side and wonders if it's thanking him for being saved. The young man feeds the animal and tells it to stay well hidden in the corners. The young man reflects with a smile on the bizarre condition required for his magic. He remembers that before turning into a crow, he ended up touching the bird directly. Recalling the horse and the squirrel, he notices the exact pattern among all of them. The young man concludes he needs to touch the nape of the animal's neck to trigger the transformation. With the mystery solved, he worries about the danger Princess Mental poses. The young man recalls the terrifying face of the first princess and notes how much more frightening she is in person. The maid helped cover for the young man, claiming the animal was her pet, allowing his escape through the window. He returned to his human form and went back to the room, believing the problem had been resolved. Princess Mental commented on her youngest brother's strange taste and said goodbye, mentioning it was late. However, she gave a direct order commanding the young man to meet her in her quarters the following day. The noble gave a sinister smile, coldly asserting that they had serious matters to discuss. In his room, the young man grows apprehensive, trying to guess what the princess wants to speak with him about. The young man worries, fearing she might have discovered his true identity as a transmigrator. With no choice to decline the invitation, the young man accepts his fate and decides to face the conversation head-on. The next day, the guard bows solemnly as he receives the seventh prince at the palace entrance. The young man observes the gigantic doors of the princess's quarters, confirming the place is luxurious. Upon entering the room, Princess Mental greets her younger brother with a fake tone of welcome. The noble tells the young man to sit on the couch, while he prefers to get straight to the point of the conversation. The princess changes her tone of voice and asks with a terrifying smile if he didn't hear her order. The young man senses the threat in the air and immediately apologizes for his lack of manners. The young man sits on the couch while the princess laughs, saying he was always an impatient person. The noble analyzes her younger brother suspiciously, remembering he never showed interest in the forest. The young man grows tense, knowing full well the immense danger of facing that woman. He remembers that the imperial family's magic always manifests through natural elements. However, Princess Mental's mystical power is unique and stands out above the rest. Her power targets humans, allowing her to read and manipulate anyone's mind. The noble demands that he speak the truth, saying she hates when people try to deceive her family. With her hand on his head, the young man tries to stay calm, noticing that magic doesn't work on him. He deduces that if the mind reading worked, she would have already controlled him to get answers. From the novel, he knows her magic fails on blood relatives, and under another special condition. The second condition requires that the person feel genuine, true familial love for her. The young man finds that completely absurd, as he could never feel affection for such a cruel woman. He remains intrigued, unable to understand the real reason her magic has no effect on his body. The scene shifts to a dark cave, where the sound of a waterfall echoes in the background. Water drops begin dripping from the stone ceiling, slowly falling through the darkness. A droplet glistens in the air, about to hit the face of someone unconscious on the ground. The water strikes the former commander's face, directly as he lies in the cave. The veteran slowly opens his eyes, feeling the cold water wet his battle wounds. The Duke groans in pain, trying to move as he slowly regains consciousness. The warrior sits up disoriented, wondering if this place is the realm of the dead. A voice warns that he survived, and the veteran startles upon seeing a cloaked man sitting nearby. The hooded young man explains the Duke spent so long unconscious that he appeared to have passed away. Without wasting time, the mysterious young man grips the hilt of his sword and prepares to pose a question. Littell unsheaths his sword and points it at the Duke, demanding to know if he is loyal to the Empire. With yellowish eyes, the young man warns that the answer will determine whether the veteran remains alive. Back at the palace, the protagonist still doesn't understand why her magic failed on him. The princess insists on her question, wanting to know why he changed so much all of a sudden. The young man wonders if the magic's failure is related to him possessing that body. He remembers that the seventh prince was such an irrelevant character that he barely appeared in the book. Mental mocks her brother's silence, saying she can see his brain working fast. The young man thinks about playing dumb, but fears the noble won't accept such a simple excuse. The young man pulls away from the princess's hand, deciding to act like the former prince would in that situation. Seeing that he won't speak, Mental walks back, warning she will use another method to get answers. The first princess claps her hands and calls the imperial knights to enter the room. The armed guards enter the room, and the noble complains that her brother refuses to answer her questions. The first princess orders the guards to slice Ran Aberon's mouth with their swords to make him speak, throwing the knights into panic. The guards indignantly refuse, stating that humble servants could never commit such atrocity against the prince. The knight kneels, begging the princess to reconsider the order, but she complains angrily about the noise they are making. The noble activates her glowing eyes and states with a completely dark look that she deeply despises any kind of noise. Using her mind manipulation power, she takes control of the guards, forcing the knights' bodies to move against their will. Under the noble's mystical control, the guard draws his sword from its sheath, unable to resist the imposed command. The two knights position their sharp blades against the young man's neck, while asking themselves in desperation, what is happening? The princess mocks him, saying that since her younger brother refuses to answer, she has no choice left but to act that way. She commands the young man to choose his words very carefully, warning that this is his only chance to walk out of there alive. The young man interrupts the noble and suddenly blurts out that his biological mother just passed away. He keeps his face in shadow while maintaining that unexpected statement before the princess. The princess gets completely confused by the revelation and demands to know what exactly the young man is talking about. She questions what made him think that and asks if he was in contact with his mother all this time. The young man feigns sadness and replies that isn't it, explaining he merely felt the tragic event. He makes up a story that before leaving, his mother left him a beautiful necklace with a glowing blue gem in the center. The young man relates that his mother promised they would meet again as long as the light shone, but the blue glow started to fade. He continues the story, saying that without warning, the gem turned completely black and shattered right after. The young man says that after the initial panic, a sad thought ended up crossing his mind at that moment. He claims to have realized that his mother finally rested in peace in her homeland located in the east. Inside, the protagonist knows full well that whole emotional story is nothing more than a blatant lie. He recalls from the book that the prince's mother was the only lover to manage to escape the cruel imperial family. The novel never explained the reason for her escape, merely assuming the woman had returned to the east. Some rumors claimed she fled because she gave birth to a black-haired boy without the royal blessing. Regardless of the real reason, the woman never appeared again until the end of the original story. Mental remarks that she thought he hated his mother, and the young man admits that in childhood, he only felt resentment over the abandonment. He places his hand on his shirt, saying he looked at the eastern sky every night holding that necklace. The young man pulls out the broken gem and opens up, feigning emotion while saying that deep down he missed her. Placing the gem on the table, he falsely reflects on how years of resentment turned into longing upon learning of his relative's death. The young man concludes the act, saying that perhaps family bonds are precisely that strong connection. The first princess observes her younger brother in total silence, seemingly moved by the emotional speech. The noble orders the knights to sheath their swords and wait outside the room. With glowing eyes, she orders the guards to completely erase from their minds everything they saw in the room. The knights immediately leave the room, and the heavy wooden door closes behind them. While the young man hopes the plan worked, the princess approaches, lamenting her younger brother's suffering. She holds the young man's hands affectionately, comforting his pain, while the protagonist mentally celebrates the act's success. The noble asserts that even if he is a black-haired failure, he is still her little brother, making the young man annoyed. The young man ponders that the mind manipulation power failing on him justified the initial distrust of the cruel princess. He celebrates surviving with the lie, knowing the gem was nothing more than cheap junk jewelry he picked up somewhere. The young man wonders about the Duke's whereabouts, remembering that in the book he fell into a valley and lost his legs. He mentally observes the valley landscape, hoping the experienced warrior didn't pass away in the fall. At the bottom of the ravine, the Duke groans in pain on the ground, knowing he shouldn't move carelessly. The cloaked young man coldly warns that his right leg is completely broken. Disarmed and with a fractured leg, the veteran realizes he doesn't stand a chance of fighting in that state. Even in the dark, the Duke recognizes the stranger's perfect stance, noticing the young man is insanely strong. Panicking, the veteran begs the young man to lower his sword and explain what is going on. The cloaked young man stares at the veteran and calmly deduces he must not have been awake for long. The young man says that days ago he was chasing a flying water sphere through the sky, but ended up losing its trail. He explains that someone appeared to be inside the bubble, and he assumed the person died from the violent fall. The Duke is shocked to realize the young man is talking about his execution, wondering how he stayed alive after the impact. The veteran looks at his baggage and begins suspecting that special bag of stones saved his life. The Duke searches the ground for his bag, realizing it got lost during the chaos of the execution. The cloaked young man says he happened to find an old man lying covered in blood inside a nearby cave. The hooded young man drives his sword into the wall right beside the veteran's face, startling the old warrior. He gets close with the sharp blade, keeping the former commander cornered against the cave rock. The young man asks in the name of the goddess Amica if he is loyal to the Empire, leaving the veteran surprised to hear that name. The Duke despairs upon realizing he ran straight into a follower of the sect considered heretical. He recalls miserable people collapsing in the streets, noting that was unfortunately a common scene in the kingdom. The veteran remembers the suffering of his son and his young assistant before making that difficult decision. He recalls the cruelty of the nobles mocking his blind loyalty and threatening to turn his son into another servile hound. Facing the sharp blade, the experienced warrior hesitates for a moment before answering the cloaked young man. The image of his beloved son comes to mind, strengthening his resolve to break with ancient tradition. The veteran thinks of the boy as his greatest treasure and decides he will never serve that imperial tyranny again. He remembers the Empire's dogmas, which demanded the immediate elimination of anyone deemed heretical. The former commander lets out a heavy sigh as he makes his final decision before the young man's sword. He firmly declares that he owes no loyalty to the Empire, asserting he is merely an aimless old man. Tied by the leg, the veteran limps along, thanking him for the treatment, but without asking where he is being taken. The old man asks the young man to untee the rope from his ankle, but the hooded young man coldly refuses the request. The veteran argues that if he falls, he won't be able to get up, which will create much more work for the young man to carry him. Hearing the old man's complaint, the hooded young man stops walking and looks back with a very serious expression. Without saying a single word, the young man simply yanks the rope hard, forcing the veteran to hurry up. The old man loses his balance from the jolt, grumbling angrily, being completely ignored by the boy. The Duke reflects intriguingly on the existence of a hidden cave nearby and remembers hearing the goddess's name. He remembers that Amica's followers were reported wiped out 50 years ago and is astonished by the discovery. Recalling the moment before passing out inside the water bubble, he tries to calculate the exact location of where he fell. The veteran decides to memorize the entire cave path so he can return later bringing armed reinforcements. He keeps walking slowly while observing the details of the stone walls around him. The old man finds it ironic to see himself acting like the Necromancer even after betraying the royal family. Suddenly, the hooded young man halts his walk and stops moving in the middle of the dark tunnel. The young man turns to the former commander and asks his name, catching the old warrior completely off guard. The former commander thinks for a moment and officially introduces himself using only the name Agony Fetus. The young man touches the mystical wall and explains that the cave is protected by an ancient divine blessing. He draws his sword and asserts that no one from the Empire can enter that sanctuary of their own free will. With a swift movement, the young man drives the blade into the ground, unleashing a massive wave of yellow magical energy. Mystical symbols glow on the floor as a colossal structure rises beneath the cave's destroyed rocks. The old Duke covers his eyes, frightened by the radiant glow illuminating the entire dark environment. Stones begin to float around the boy, while a sacred light reveals the interior of that grand temple. A majestic cathedral appears before the two, and and the young man warns that there are only two reasons for the old man to be there. The young man declares that either the veteran is a lackey sent to wipe them out, or he was guided by the goddess's call. The young man welcomes him to the sacred domain of Amica, regardless of what the former commander's intentions may be. The scene shifts to night at the Imperial Palace, where a groan of pain echoes through the tower window. Reisha holds the blue magical stone, trying to contain his mortal illness while suffering from coughing fits. Relaxed on the couch, the protagonist thinks that the acceleration of events will force the Duke and the hero to act faster. He hopes to receive news from the heroine, amidst a feeling a bit guilty for making the Duke suffer in the process. Suddenly, Reisha slams the table outraged, demanding a larger quantity of the magical medicine to speed up the cure. The youngest brother looks on with an extremely cold expression and asks if the crown prince just shouted at him. Frightened, the heir steps back slightly and tries to justify himself, saying he is just frustrated with the treatment's delay. The protagonist calmly warns that rushing the cure will destroy the heir's body, but the man insists on a fast method. Reisha asks if there isn't something more dangerous than the hookah, leaving the young man confused by the sudden question. The heir indignantly reminds him that on the first day, his younger brother told him to stop using the hookah if he was concerned. The young man gives a mocking smile and replies he only said to stop because it's bad for his health, making Reisha furious. Reisha walks away cursing in anger, while the young man thinks that the hookah really is destroying the heir's body. The protagonist notes that the wine and meals consumed by Reisha act as pure poison to his health. The young man reflects that Reisha will depend on that treatment until his last breath unless the seed in his body is removed. The young man warns that they need to wrap up the treatment so they aren't late for the palace's night ritual. An intense blue light of mystical energy illuminates the entire sacred hall where the ritualistic event takes place. Reisha places his hand over the magical circle, gathering his massive water energy before everyone present. The heir stands out at the altar, displaying impressive power before the nobility gathered in the imperial hall. The princes on the balcony watch, impressed by the huge amount of mana demonstrated by their older brother. The elderly church elder announces the end of the ritual unless any other participant wishes to demonstrate their power. Members of the royal family begin walking together down the corridor, leaving the ritual hall. The youngest brother decides to stay seated in the room, waiting for everyone to leave to avoid drawing his relatives' attention. A pink-haired prince approaches insolently, grabbing the youngest brother's head and mocking his presence. The boy mocks the youngest brother's mother, and the protagonist thinks about how he'll need to teach that spoiled kid a lesson. The first princess appears right behind them, observing the interaction, and notices the youngest brother seemed down during the ritual. The pink-haired panics at the noble's presence, while the protagonist greets his older sister. The princess asks if he feels unwell, and the youngest brother replies with a smile that rituals tend to be a bit boring. She smiles relieved and affectionately advises that he shouldn't show so much disinterest in important ceremonies. The noble bids a gentle farewell and walks out, leaving the two princes standing at the room's entrance. The pink-haired boy grabs the youngest brother's collar, demanding to know why the princess gives attention to someone so insignificant. Suddenly, a firm hand grabs the pink-haired boy's shoulder, stopping the young man's attack instantly. Second prince intervenes and coldly questions if there is some kind of problem with their youngest brother. The protagonist calmly fixes his clothes and lies, saying they were merely exchanging friendly sibling talk. The young man politely says goodbye and walks away from the area, giving no chance for further taunts from the princes. He passes by the second prince, showing a subtle, confident smile for having navigated the situation. In the corridor, the other princes join the heir as they walk toward their respective quarters. The protagonist remembers that the second prince always supports the heir, while Selos runs after him outraged. Selos mentions the current leader of House Fetus and asks if the youngest brother knows the young man named Talon. The pink-haired boy reveals in surprise that the ruined family's new representative is plotting something suspicious. He explains that the strange movement is happening in the central territory handed over in exchange for the late Duke's life. Raizia interrupts the conversation, showing total disdain and stating he doesn't care about insignificant people. The heir points out that the family will last 1 year at most, and that territory will return to the empire very soon. The second prince glares at his brother and coldly suggests there's no need to wait a whole year for that. The noble gives a malicious smile and claims to have a great idea to hasten the end of the ruined family. A violent punch strikes the stone wall of the passageway, making the hallway shake from the impact. Celos pins the youngest brother against the wall and demands to know who he is, receiving only a calm answer from the young man. With flames in his hand, the boy threatens to burn him, demanding to understand why the nobility pays attention to the youngest. The protagonist asks if attacking him would put the boy himself in an extremely complicated situation. The youngest brother mocks his sibling's weak magic, saying those flames would barely serve to light a lamp. The young man warns that if the nobility finds out about that foolish assault, the boy's future will be in danger. Frightened by the youngest brother's stance, the boy backs off, and the protagonist takes the chance to set his conditions. Pointing his finger, the young man commands his brother to fix his lack of respect when speaking to an older relative. Meanwhile, in a dark torture room, agonizing screams echo near iron instruments stained in blood. The executioner uses iron tools to bind and stretch the prisoner's mouth without any mercy. The cruel punishment ordered by Talon is executed in the shadows, silencing the servant forever. In the mansion, a portrait of the late Duke remains prominently displayed on the main room's wall. A violent blow shatters the veteran's painting, reducing the frame and image to several pieces. The former commander's belongings are piled up in the courtyard as they declare that the Duke never existed. Talon brings the torch close to the pile, decreeing that there will be no funeral or tombstone, so that the Duke is forgotten. The fire consumes the late commander's memories before all the workers, who are threatened with severe punishment. Sometime later, a servant knocks on the office door, announcing he brought an important report for the new leader. Knight Commander Jack enters the office to deliver his report to the acting leader. Jack reports that he arrested the rumor spreaders, punished them severely, and expelled them from the Order of Knights. The commander yawns out of fatigue after spending the entire night applying harsh punishments against the undisciplined. He apologizes for the yawn, explaining the lack of staff, and Talon praises the commander's good work. The young representative hands over a scroll containing the complete list of deserters from the mansion. Jack worriedly reports that half of the house's forces have already fled despite increased security at the location. Talon knows that if discipline fails, the family will fall completely, given that allies have severed all ties. The commander questions if erasing traces of the late Duke won't outrage the knights loyal to the former leader. Talon stares at the man with a terrifying look and asks if he still considers Agony the true leader. Frightened by the reaction, the commander backs off, apologizing, and admits he had difficulty accepting the betrayal. The veteran laments that a man who was always fiercely loyal ended up in such a dishonorable way. He observes the young man before him and feels he is dealing with a completely different person than before. The commander wonders if the pain of the Duke's betrayal transformed the timid assistant into that cold man. Talon slams his hand on the table and resolutely announces that the time has come to take the next step in the plan. The new representative walks with the commander and the guards toward the mansion's main courtyard. A worker approaches and announces that all preparations for the public address are completed. The young man climbs the stone steps with firm strides to address all the gathered workers. He steps onto the raised castle platform, catching the attention of the crowd of servants gathered below. All the mansion's staff watch in silence as the territory's new leaders occupy the stage. The workers whisper in fear, remembering the cooks whose tongues were cut out the previous day. The workers fear being branded as traitors by the Empire and consider fleeing before it's too late. The fear of being caught trying to escape terrifies the crowd while Talon takes a deep breath atop the stage. The young man solemnly declares that House Fetus has served the Empire with honor for over 1,000 consecutive years. He acknowledges the recent chaos in the territory and asserts that everyone there knows exactly what caused it. With a stern glare, Talon openly points out that former Commander Agony acted as a wretched traitor. The commander and subordinates on the stage stand shocked by the young man's audacity in condemning the former Duke. He explains that the veteran's betrayal shattered all the wealth and ancient honor the family built. From the balcony above, young Flynn listens to the speech while Talon acknowledges the workers' distrust. The new leader surprises the crowd by giving a final opportunity for voluntary departure to anyone wishing to leave. He guarantees that even those with years left on their contracts will be freed from service without any punishment. The young man takes a dramatic pause and demands that everyone engrave his next words deeply into their minds. He shouts with determination, reminding them that the house still has those who honor the ancient 1,000-year oath. Talon vows before the crowd that he will prove the family's loyalty until little Flynn takes over as Duke. The family's official banner sways in the wind as the young man issues a grim warning to everyone there. With a terrifying expression, Talon threatens that any future disloyalty will be punished without an ounce of mercy. The crowd of workers trembles in horror before the new mansion leader's imposing and ruthless presence. The commander and worker stand speechless, noticing the overwhelming impact of that speech. Jack recognizes the young man's threatening tone, but mentally admits his words were correct. The commander thinks that with the legitimate heir alive, there are still plenty of chances to prove loyalty to the king. He concludes that the firmer the young man's leadership is, the faster the mansion will regain its stability. Jack fondly remembers the time when servants teased the timid assistant without him reacting badly. The assistant congratulates Talon, and the young man asks if the sacred temple responded to the request for an audience. The subordinate reveals that after the Duke's betrayal, the temple refuses to receive any member of the family. The young representative states he already expected that rejection and places his hand inside his coat. He hands over a mystical scroll, ordering it to be sent with the message that they won't regret reading it. Inside a carriage on the road, Talon wonders why the Duke rebelled, knowing he would meet his end. He questions whether saving the temple's miserable wanderers was worth sacrificing his own life for. Looking out the window, the young man reflects that even without understanding his late master's reasons, he will press on. With a determined glare, the young man promises he will never let his master's sacrifice be in vain. As the carriage wheels spin, he asks his former master's spirit to watch over the future of that territory. Talon steps out of the carriage as soon as he arrives in front of the grand Imperial Temple. The temple's monumental structures stands imposingly before the young representative's eyes. He observes the sanctuary's magnificent architecture, admiring the grand scale of the building. The young man remembers he has a deadline of only 1 year to restructure the entire mansion. He walks firmly through a noisy crowd gathered near the sanctuary. Adjusting his glasses, Talon vows to use everything he has to stop the heir's plans. On the temple balcony, Reiji observes the filthy wanderers and comments on the people's curiosity. With a wicked smile, the heir confesses his desire to crush that crowd like insects. Meanwhile, in the Imperial Forest, the youngest prince reaches the area reserved for medium-sized animals. With the squirrel on his shoulder, he decides he has caught enough small animals and seeks larger prey. The young man holds the little squirrel and complains about it hiding again to follow him. The young man puts the little creature in his bag, warning that the place is dangerous and telling it not to leave. He finds the creature's cleverness strange and wonders if the squirrel was also transmigrated into the novel. Suddenly, the youngest prince hears a terrifying growl and turns quickly to check the danger. The young man gets ready excitedly, celebrating finding the creature after 1 hour of searching. A massive gray wolf emerges from the brush, displaying its sharp fangs and drooling with rage. The young man greets the wolf peacefully, saying he only wants to touch the nape of its neck before leaving. He reaches out his hands slowly, believing he could touch the animal just like he did with the others. However, the beast leaps furiously, charging straight toward the young man with a terrifying roar. The young man backs away, worried about the possibility of having his hand devoured by the wild beast. Without thinking twice, the youngest prince takes off in a desperate escape through the forest while shouting in terror. The giant wolf chases the young man at high speed, while he runs holding onto the squirrel. He argues with the annoyed rodent, trying to figure out why the creature provoked such a dangerous beast. The young man remembers that the beast was actually gentle and only needed a light pat on its neck. But the little squirrel attacked the wolf's snout by surprise, ruining any chance of a peaceful approach. The youngest prince yells angrily, telling the rodent to face the music alone for picking a fight with the beast. The predator quickly gains ground, forcing the young man to think about which animal to transform into. He realizes turning into another land animal won't help, and there's no time to turn into a crow. Desperate, the youngest prince wishes from the bottom of his heart to run and fly at the same time in his escape. The little squirrel in his hand makes a confused face upon, sensing the strange mystical alteration in his body. The wolf suddenly stops running and looks up at the sky, perplexed by what it just saw. The beast tracks with its eyes a bizarre silhouette, ascending at high speed toward the clouds. The little squirrel sighs in relief, clinging to the back of the young man, who managed to escape the attack in the skies. Now safe in the air, the youngest prince analyzes his new mystical body and realizes the true secret of his magic. He gets euphoric upon discovering that his ability allows him to mix animal traits and sprout wings on the wolf. At the temple, the crowd comments that all that territory will belong to the late duke's family. The people question the former duke's sanity and mock the mental state of the new representative. Some greedy men suspect the presence of a hidden treasure and plan to find it first. Street kids take advantage of the crowd of distracted people to start pickpocketing. Blending into the crowd, Littell watches everything in silence, trying to understand Talon's intentions. From high on the platform, Talon stares at all those people, waiting for the right moment to announce the plan. The young man holds up 2 fingers high in the air, declaring a deadline of only 2 months. He sternly decrees that any remaining wanderer at the location after 2 months will be punished for desecration. The homeless residents fall into absolute despair, asking where they will go after being driven away. Scared by the announcement, the young thieves warn their companions to flee as quickly as possible. The nobles in the audience are surprised by the young man's firmness and deduce he is trying to please the empire. A wanderer shouts from the crowd, demanding to know what will be built on that vacant land. With a calm look, the young representative answers openly that he will build a large hospital on the site. He announces that the family will erect the hospital and teach medical arts to all the local workers. The nobles are bewildered by the absurd idea of teaching medicine to common folk. Some noblewomen begin laughing at Talon's decision, commenting that the bankrupt family will only sink deeper into ruin. The hooded young man thinks the chances of the plan succeeding are nearly zero, with everyone avoiding house fetus. The bespectacled young man thinks he overestimated Talon and doesn't need to worry about him anymore before being interrupted. Suddenly, a furious shout echoes, asking who dares to laugh at that man, leaving everyone in shock. A luxurious white carriage arrives, suddenly parting the crowd of confused people. The carriage door opens, and a person in religious robes slowly steps down under everyone's watchful eyes. High Priest Vesper appears unexpectedly and declares in God's name that he supports Talon as leader of House Fetus. The crowd panics upon recognizing the High Priest, and everyone begins to kneel as a sign of respect. People bow humbly on the ground as the prominent religious figure walks through the temple. Vesper approaches Talon amicably, who kneels, demonstrating deep respect for the religious leader. The elderly man begins addressing the people, saying they are all travelers destined for the same divine path. The priest continues, stating that evil always tempts people, but exalts those who choose to follow the righteous path. He reminds them that House Fetus was tarnished by a single sinner whose terrible sin can never be erased. Even with the stain of the past, the clergyman raises his hand, pointing out that someone is still trying to follow the right course. The high priest extends his hand and blesses the journey of atonement that young Tallin has decided to walk. Tallin expresses immense gratitude for the kind words, and the priest replies that he could not simply ignore the situation. The elderly man invites the young man to join him in the carriage and pay respects to the Great Sierra at the temple. Tallin pretends to be emotional while thinking that wretched old man only showed up there to put on a cheap show. He remembers his family will cover all expenses and that the temple demanded half the profits from the hospital and academy. The young man knows the greedy priest must have grinned ear to ear upon reading the letter accepting those terms. In any case, the young man has no regrets, as he needed the high priest's backing to move his plan forward. As he passes through the crowd, Tallin subtly whispers that it was good to see young Master Melio disguised there. The hooded young man goes into complete shock, wondering since when Tallin knew he was there. The young man with glasses calmly remarks that the world isn't such an easy thing to turn upside down. A violent punch strikes the ground, while someone yells in annoyance at the sudden appearance of that old priest. The blonde noble comments that the insect acted cleverly by securing the public backing of the powerful high priest. The blonde gives a mocking smile, saying the future emperor doesn't need to worry because he already has a plan. The furious brother kicks the door, saying he'll listen later and that he needs to take a life right now just to calm down. The blonde noble keeps holding his wine glass near the window while observing the situation thoughtfully. He asks his assistant about Tallin, and the servant confirms that the young man served the late Duke for 13 years. The blonde swirls the wine in his glass, complaining that lately there are too many things deeply testing his patience. With an insanely fast and violent motion, he strikes suddenly without any warning. The glass cup shatters directly against the assistant's face, covering the man in blood. The cruel prince smiles, saying that just seeing the servant standing there is enough to make him even angrier. Even with his forehead bleeding profusely, the loyal assistant simply bows his head and calmly apologizes. The noble complains that the man is dull for not screaming, but admits he keeps him around precisely for that reason. The blonde sits in his chair and orders the servant to investigate the tax records of Tallin's family. He orders the count arrested if they find irregularities and commands forging evidence to lock him up either way. The prince complains about the sunny day, remarks that the first prince's condition is deteriorating far too fast. He remains silent for a brief moment while taking in the sunny landscape outside. He gives a macabre smile, concluding that seeing the hair recover would also be extremely irritating. Meanwhile, a firm knock on the door announces Assistant Pale's arrival outside Tallin's office. The servant reports that preparations for the hospital are finished and that noble applications exceeded the limit. The assistant worriedly warns that the wanderers still haven't left the center and that the deadline is almost up. Tallin rejects the idea of sending Commander Jack's soldiers, saying he already has a strategy in mind. The assistant accepts the answer and takes the opportunity to deliver a letter that just arrived from House Chryso itself. Tallin holds the scroll, surprised by the contact from his biological family, and wonders what they are planning. Upon reading the document, he discovers that Igo Chrysa is planning to make an official visit to the fetus mansion. The young representative is completely in shock upon realizing that the one coming to visit him is his own brother. 2 weeks pass, and a maid opens the large wooden door, announcing the arrival of a new visitor. Commander Jack and the servants wait apprehensively outside Tallin's office. Inside the room, a mysterious guest calmly places his teacup on the coffee table. Talon holds his head in deep concern as he watches his older brother sip his tea. His older brother, Igo Krysa, shares that their father was placed under house arrest just last night. He reports that the imperial family's tax audit claims to have uncovered severe fraud that could land their father in prison. Talon questions whether his brother truly believes their father would do such a thing, and Igo asserts that the family is in crisis. The young man with glasses defends his father, claiming he never sought pleasure or power and always lived a quiet life. Igo glares at Talon with a serious expression, asking if he really has no idea about the true reason behind it. Talon asks irritably if his brother wants to force him to admit he is responsible for the entire family's ruin. Igo changes the subject and mentions hearing that Talon is putting the Central Wanderers to work on the construction projects. He notes that providing shelter and food in exchange for labor boosted construction progress and improved area safety. The brother adds that he also learned about the freed distribution of soup and meals for children. However, he reveals his true fear, explaining that the first prince's initial plan was something dreadful. The young man with glasses goes into complete shock upon hearing that the royal heir intended to eliminate all the wanderers. Talon gets up angrily and tells his brother to leave if he only came there to waste his time. Igo sadly asks his younger brother to reconsider the situation, reminding him that the man under arrest is still his father. Talon fires back with deep bitterness, recalling that his father abandoned him without hesitation over 13 years ago. Elsewhere, a noblewoman walks angrily down a dark corridor, complaining about the exhausting preparations for the ritual. Mental furiously questions how long she'll have to remain locked in that underground sanctuary because of the event. She vents, saying that spending the entire day surrounded only by annoying servants is driving her completely mad. Suddenly, she runs into an imposing presence in the hallway, making her stop talking instantly. The woman in the brown dress stares at the first princess, surprised to find her walking so restlessly. Mental makes a polite bow and asks if the Empress came to that isolated place specifically to visit her. The Empress remarks that she should be in the prayer room, and the young woman sarcastically asks if she's worried. The Empress reveals she worries every day because Mental is her own blood daughter and fears she might make mistakes. The princess smiles, saying her mother is being affectionate today and suggests having tea outdoors to talk better. However, the Empress coldly turns her back, announcing she needs to meet with the Emperor and orders her daughter to go back. As she watches her mother walk away, the princess grows suspicious, knowing the Emperor should be staying at the castle right now. She wonders if that was a blatant lie in layman's, that her manipulation power doesn't work on the Empress. The young woman's gaze turns ice cold as she ponders the strange behavior of her biological mother. She stands frozen in the middle of the underground hallway, consumed by intriguing thoughts about the family secret. Back in the forest, a violent crash echoes through the foliage, scaring a small animal that lets out a squeak. The little squirrel holds tightly onto a tree branch, trembling as it watches the dust settle on the ground. Coughing heavily, the youngest prince leans his hand against a tree trunk, celebrating in relief that he survived the fall. He reflects on how incredible his magic ability is, allowing him not only to transform into animals, but to blend species at will. He leans on the trunk, feeling sudden intense dizziness. Realizing that such great power must have some side effect, he wonders if excessive use reduces his lifespan, as he feels his body suddenly burn with fever. The feverish heat rapidly intensifies, causing the young man to collapse helplessly onto the forest floor. The small squirrel slowly climbs down the tree and curiously approaches the unconscious body of its young master. Not knowing what to do, the little creature starts lightly patting the young man's head, trying to wake him up somehow. The rodent leaps back after placing a tiny seed on the hair of the young man passed out on the ground. It crosses its front paws with a suspicious expression while observing the protagonist's silence. To everyone's surprise, the little animal begins to speak, asking if the youngest prince really passed out. The squirrel complains about the young man's weakness, while the massive shadow of the dangerous gray wolf reappears right behind them. The little rodent gets a terrifying fright upon noticing the silent approach of the forest's grand predator. The giant wolf opens its sharp jaw, letting out a frightening growl right toward the defenseless little animal. Annoyed, the squirrel slaps the wolf's snout multiple times, telling it to shut its mouth so it doesn't wake its master. The beast backs away, whimpering under the lectures of the tiny squirrel, who scolds the giant wolf's petty behavior. The wolf lies on the ground docilely and submissively, pointing its snout at the young man stretched out ahead. The clever rodent starts laughing triumphantly, celebrating its absolute mastery over the feared monster. The imposing wolf becomes completely bewildered by the small squirrel's fearless attitude and noisy commands. Meanwhile, the youngest prince continues sleeping soundly on the grass, having no idea about the commotion. A glowing spiritual entity appears and explains to the wolf that the boy is the human they had been waiting for. Understanding the mystical message, the wolf raises its head and lets out a loud howl that echoes throughout the forest. The mysterious sound catches the attention of several birds perched on branches, who begin watching the forest. The deer also listen attentively as the spirit orders the message to be spread to all animals. The golden entity commands that every creature in the forest be notified that the one they awaited so long has finally arrived. Spirit watches the young man resting and remarks that although he is still weak, that will change very soon. In another part of the dense forest, a family of wild boars quietly feeds among the trees.